Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past rises from the dust and speaks again. Today, you are about to enter one of the most dramatic, painful, and world-shaping chapters of human history, the Byzantine Iconoclasm. This was not just a debate about sacred pictures. It was a storm of faith and fear, politics and prophecy, blood and belief. It was a century-long war where emperors battled monks, where armies carried theology into war, where families were divided by ideology, and where art itself stood on trial. In the next journey, you will witness the rise and fall of emperors who believed they could reshape God's will, monks who chose exile and death rather than surrender their icons, an empire tearing itself apart from the inside, women protecting icons in secret at home, soldiers fighting wars believing theology would decide victory, economies collapsing and reborn, churches stripped bare and later reborn in glittering gold, families hiding icons under floors just to keep faith alive, and the moment when an entire empire finally said, "No more." This history will take you across courts, monasteries, battlefields, villages, palaces, and hearts. You'll hear the echo of prayers whispered behind closed doors, the clashing of beliefs, and the roar of an empire trying to save its soul. Iconoclasm reshaped Christianity forever. It changed art forever. It changed Europe forever. It changed the future of Russia, the Middle East, and even modern identity across faith traditions. If you want a story of faith versus power, emotion versus logic, humanity versus empire, then stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not only history. It is drama. It is philosophy. It is war. It is survival. This is the Byzantine Iconoclasm, the war against images. Only on History Teller YT. Let's begin. Charlemagne used iconoclasm to undermine Byzantine legitimacy. Western intellectuals have produced the Libri Carolini, a series of theological arguments against both extreme icon veneration and Byzantine iconoclasm. Although the Carolingians misunderstood Greek theology, their writing illustrated Western political ambition. The Frankish court portrayed Byzantium as heretical and culturally inferior. The rivalry fractured Christian unity. Further tension arose when Pope Adrian I rejected the Council of Hieria, declaring that only an ecumenical council shared by East and West could define doctrine. This disagreement deepened Latin suspicion toward Eastern imperial theology. In addition, artistic misunderstanding widened the gap. Western Christians used three-dimensional statues, which Eastern Orthodox rejected. This mutual confusion cultivated hostility rooted in artistic difference. Byzantium responded to Western criticism with disdain. The empire viewed Latin Christians as uncivilized newcomers, lacking philosophical depth. Eastern theologians accused Latin clergy of arrogance and ignorance. Some Byzantine writings portrayed the papacy as power-hungry, using icons as political leverage to expand influence. Meanwhile, Slavic and Bulgar kingdoms watched Byzantine internal conflict with strategic interest. Bulgaria, under Khan Telerik and Khan Krum, exploited military uncertainty created by iconoclasm. When imperial armies were distracted by religious policy, Bulgars attacked. In 811, Krum crushed the Byzantine army and killed Emperor Nikephoros I. Iconophiles claimed the defeat proved God punished iconoclasm. Iconoclasts, however, argued Irene's restoration triggered divine wrath. Religious interpretation fueled political propaganda in both directions. Beyond military outcomes, international trade developed differently under iconoclasm. Muslim merchants became essential trade partners because they respected Eastern icon restrictions more than Western traders did. Byzantine silk, jewelry, and manuscripts entered Islamic markets, while Muslim goods flowed into Constantinople. Trade with the West suffered, partly because papal bans discouraged interaction. Iconoclasm altered the empire's commercial network, integrating Byzantium more deeply into Islamic economic systems. Finally, iconoclasm redefined diplomatic rituals. Before the controversy, diplomatic delegations exchanged icons as political gifts. These objects symbolized unity and respect. During iconoclasm, such exchanges became impossible. When embassies from Rome or Frankish courts arrived, they were shocked to find churches stripped of imagery. Western leaders interpreted this as proof of spiritual decay. Thus, iconoclasm reshaped Byzantium's place in the international order. Rather than uniting Christianity against Islam, the empire became divided between East and West, weakening its diplomatic influence. To fully comprehend the global implications of iconoclasm, we must consider how rhetoric transformed international identity. Both iconoclasts and iconophiles used history to justify positions. Iconoclast emperors claimed they followed ancient biblical tradition preserved by Judaism and affirmed by Islam. They argued that Christianity had drifted into pagan practices by embracing imagery. Icon defenders, in response, argued Byzantium possessed unique spiritual heritage that neither Judaism nor Islam understood. These conflicting narratives shaped how neighboring civilizations viewed Byzantium. In the Islamic world, iconoclasm confirmed long-held suspicions that Christians were confused about their own faith. Muslim scholars wrote that Byzantine religion required constant correction because it lacked divine guidance from revelation like the Quran. Even when Byzantium renounced iconoclasm, Islamic writers mocked the reversal as indecision. This intellectual rivalry intensified cultural boundaries between Islam and Orthodoxy. However, iconoclasm inadvertently strengthened cultural exchange. Refugee monks took manuscripts and icons into the Islamic world, where they worked as translators and artists. Arabic scholarship helped preserve Aristotle and Greek philosophy, later returning this knowledge to Europe. Ironically, while empires battled, knowledge crossed borders freely. In the Latin West, the end of iconoclasm did not repair relationships. Many Western leaders believed Byzantium had acted like a heretic empire for a century. They refused to trust Constantinople completely. Over time, this suspicion contributed to the mutual excommunications of 1054, shaping the Great Schism. The legacy of iconoclasm had become foundational memory in Western theology, proof that the East allowed emperors to dominate the Church. Within Byzantium, the memory of international criticism shaped national pride. After 843, Orthodox writers began describing Byzantium as the true protector of Christian purity. They saw Rome as corrupted by political ambition and Islam as lacking doctrinal fullness. Icon veneration became the cultural boundary that distinguished Byzantium from its neighbors. Even after iconoclasm ended, diplomacy between Byzantium and Islam remained complex. Muslim rulers respected Byzantine icons after witnessing their political importance. Some caliphs purchased Byzantine icons as art objects despite religious doctrine forbidding imagery. This contradiction reveals that theological boundaries do not always determine cultural behavior. Meanwhile, Byzantine missionaries carried iconography into Slavic lands, converting Bulgaria and Kievan Rus. The adoption of icons became a defining element of Eastern Slavic identity. If iconoclasm had succeeded, Russian Christianity would look completely different. The global Orthodox world would lack one of its most powerful visual traditions. Ultimately, iconoclasm shaped how Byzantium defined itself within the global world through rivalry, dialogue, conflict, and theological exchange. It had diplomatic consequences lasting centuries, causing permanent political fractures, but also enriching cultural exchange. The Byzantine monastic world played one of the most defining roles in the drama of iconoclasm. It was among monasteries that resistance to imperial icon policies took its deepest root, shaping not only how the controversy unfolded, but also how it ultimately ended. The relationship between monks and emperors during the iconoclast periods reveals a dramatic struggle for spiritual authority, cultural memory, and political autonomy. To understand iconoclasm properly, We must explore how monastic values clashed with imperial ideology and why monks risked suffering and death to defend icons. Monastic life in Byzantium was not marginal, it was central. Monasteries served as educational institutions, economic centers, spiritual retreats, and carriers of cultural memory. They produced books, stored ancient manuscripts, copied scriptures, provided charity, healed the sick, and taught philosophy. They shaped theology, preserved liturgical chant, and offered spiritual direction to both elite and poor. When iconoclast emperors attacked monasteries, they did not simply target isolated buildings. They targeted the intellectual and moral backbone of Byzantine society. Why were monks such powerful opponents of iconoclasm? The answer lies in the nature of monastic spirituality. Monks lived through strict ascetic practice, fasting, nightly prayer, silence, and meditation on scripture. Their entire worldview rejected material ambition and political compromise. Imperial ideology, by contrast, promoted unity through state law and military success. Patriarch John the Grammarian, one of the most intellectually skilled iconoclasts, trained clergy in logical reasoning designed to dismantle icon theology. He argued through Greek philosophy that matter was inferior to spirit, and therefore unworthy for depicting divine form. His students used Aristotelian categories to prove that icons confused natures in Christ. Although iconophiles later proved these arguments flawed, the intellectual challenge forced them to sharpen their reasoning. Educational networks became divided. Some schools taught imperial iconoclast ideology to preserve funding and safety. Others practiced iconophile loyalty in secret. Teachers disguised arguments using coded language, embedding icon theology within biblical lessons. Young scholars grew up in uncertainty, forced to navigate between forbidden tradition and state doctrine. The first iconoclast period also damaged scholarly pursuits by restricting monastic literacy. Constantine V confiscated monastic estates, reducing scribal funding. Scriptorium activity declined, diminishing manuscript production. This slowed literary output, weakening preservation of early Christian texts. Ironically, after iconoclasm collapsed, scholars noticed gaps in manuscript heritage. Iconoclasm had destroyed cultural bridges between generations. Nevertheless, resistance shaped intellectual brilliance. Saint John of Damascus, living within Muslim territory and out of imperial reach, wrote masterful defenses of icons grounded in incarnation theology. His treatises became foundational to Orthodox thought. Similarly, Theodore the Studite wrote letters, hymns, and polemics that sharpened ethical reasoning and canon law. Even in exile, monks produced profound literature debating free will, political corruption, and spiritual obedience. Thus, iconoclasm reshaped Byzantine education both destructively and creatively. It attempted to limit intellectual diversity, but instead stimulated theological innovation. Iconoclast emperors, such as Constantine V, saw monasteries as threats. They refused to marry or fight, did not pay heavy taxes, and remained loyal not to the throne but to spiritual tradition. Removing icons, therefore, served a secondary purpose, weakening monastic identity. Monks believed holy images reflected spiritual reality. Daily monastic life involved extended prayer in front of icons, using imagery as tools for contemplation. Icons in cells reminded monks of virtues to pursue, sins to confess, and spiritual battles to fight. When emperors ordered icons removed, monks saw the command not only as a theological error, but a direct attack on their spiritual discipline. Removing icons meant removing spiritual weapons. The figure who embodied monastic resistance most famously was Theodore the Studite, abbot of the Staudios monastery in Constantinople. Theodore wrote powerful letters, treatises, and hymns defending icons, arguing that imperial authority had no right to interfere with doctrine. He insisted that the church, not the emperor, safeguarded truth. His writings articulated ideas that would shape Orthodox identity for centuries, including the belief that spiritual authority originates from God through tradition, not from political power. Theodore also organized networks among monasteries, connecting communities across the empire to resist iconoclasm. His influence was so great that emperors exiled him more than once. Yet exile did nothing to diminish his impact. Monks continued to copy his writings in secret, spreading them across the empire. His ability to rally monastic communities turned iconoclasm into a battle between state-imposed doctrine and monastic conscience. The imperial response was ruthless. Constantine V confiscated monastic land, forced monks into military service, destroyed libraries, and expelled abbots known to defend icons. Some monks endured torture for refusing to abandon icon veneration. Chroniclers describe scenes in which monks had icons hung around their necks before public humiliation, their beards smeared with pitch and set ablaze, or their bodies mutilated. Whether exaggerated or literal, such stories illustrate trauma embedded in Byzantine memory. Yet persecution did not silence monastic opposition, it strengthened it. The more monks suffered, the more they believed their cause was righteous. Martyrdom, in their eyes, proved icons were holy. Their sacrifice inspired laypeople, who saw monks as moral warriors defending the faith. While emperors commanded armies, monks commanded souls. The monastic world, therefore, shaped iconoclasm into something immeasurably deeper than a theological debate. It became a spiritual confrontation over who held the right to define Christian identity: a state built on military power or a religious community built on sacrifice and prayer. Monasteries preserved culture across centuries of icon destruction, acting as sanctuaries of history during times of oppression. Their role during iconoclasm demonstrates how cultural identity can survive authoritarian suppression. Many icons we recognize today survive because monks refused to surrender them. Some hid icons behind plaster walls, burying them underground or transporting them secretly across borders. In remote mountainous monasteries, treasures remained untouched simply because imperial administrators did not reach them. Without monastic preservation, Byzantine art might have vanished forever. Beyond physical preservation, monasteries safeguarded intellectual tradition. During the first iconoclast period, many monks refused to accept imperial decrees, continuing to write and teach icon theology underground. Their writings kept doctrinal arguments alive while official libraries were censored. When Irene restored icons in 787, monastic writings became essential sources for council debate. Without these preserved texts, the Second Council of Nicaea might not have had the theological resources necessary to reverse iconoclasm. Monks also provided moral support for communities experiencing fear and confusion. When icons were removed from churches, many believers questioned whether God remained present. Priests struggled to comfort congregations without visual guidance. Monks supplied spiritual leadership, offering confession, prayer, and counsel. They reminded people that faith existed beyond imperial control. Economically, monasteries suffered greatly under iconoclasm. Constantine V seized monastic estates, redistributing land to soldiers to reward loyalty. Many monasteries lost farmland, vineyards, workshops, and livestock. This economic attack reduced monastic independence, forcing monks to rely on charity or simple farming for survival. Some monasteries collapsed entirely under financial pressure. Yet others, supported by local communities, managed to survive through trade, agriculture, or discreet sponsorship by nobles. Their survival reflected public loyalty to monastic values. Monasteries also shaped gender roles during iconoclasm. Convents played a major role in preserving icon devotion among Byzantine women. Female monasteries taught literacy, music, and theology. Nuns wrote letters defending icons, embroidered sacred cloth containing symbolic imagery, and sheltered icon painters. Women used their domestic networks to hide icons in household shrines. Their participation reveals that iconoclasm impacted women differently. Many viewed the destruction of icons as attacks on personal intimacy with God. Another crucial monastic contribution was the preservation of liturgy. Iconoclast emperors altered worship, eliminating hymns that reference saints or icon imagery. Monks resisted these changes, memorizing traditional chants and teaching them secretly to novices. After Restoration, this preserved knowledge allowed Orthodox worship to return quickly to its older, richer forms. The endurance of Byzantine chant today owes much to monastic protection. Monasteries also became refugee centers. When imperial police destroyed icons, believers fled to monasteries seeking protection. Monks offered food, shelter, and education to displaced families. This humanitarian role strengthened monastic reputation and helped build future religious communities around monasteries. Philosophically, monks defended the unity of body and spirit by honoring icons. They argued that material objects could participate in holiness because God created matter. Their teaching influenced Eastern Orthodox theology permanently, shaping future doctrines on sacraments, relics, and liturgical worship. Because of monastic resistance, iconoclasm never fully conquered Byzantine society. The monks served as guardians of memory, teachers of truth, and protectors of community identity. Their efforts formed the backbone of Orthodox spirituality. Without them, the restoration of icons might have been impossible. The end of iconoclasm transformed monastic life dramatically. When icons were restored in 843, monasteries that had survived years of persecution emerged stronger than ever. Their spiritual credibility soared. Ordinary believers viewed monasteries as protectors of authentic Christianity, while emperors realized they could not ignore monastic influence. The Orthodox Church honored monks as confessors and martyrs, celebrating their resistance in liturgical readings and annual commemorations. Monasteries grew rapidly after 843. New foundations spread across Byzantium, especially on Mount Athos, which became a major center for Orthodox monasticism. Athonite monasticism emphasized strict ascetic practice, mystical experience, and icon devotion. The trauma of iconoclasm created hunger for deeper spirituality and visible faith, drawing people to monastic life in large numbers. Monasteries also regained material wealth. Lands confiscated by iconoclast emperors were returned, donations poured in, and monastic workshops revived icon production on a massive scale. This economic revival led to renewed scholarship. Monks copied manuscripts, wrote biographies of saints, and produced canon law summaries. These texts helped shape medieval Byzantine identity. The relationship between monasteries and imperial power also evolved. After the iconoclast periods, emperors rarely attempted to control theology directly. They recognized that attacking monasteries risked another spiritual catastrophe. Instead, rulers relied on monastic blessings to legitimize political decisions. This gave monasteries political leverage. Intellectually, the trauma of iconoclasm deepened monastic thought. Monks wrote extensively on suffering, martyrdom, and perseverance. They compared their experience to early Christian persecution under Rome. These writings emphasized that truth survives through sacrifice. They argued that the church, not the empire, defines orthodoxy, a principle that shaped later ecclesiastical independence. Monastic iconography also changed. Post 843 icons often depicted scenes from iconoclasm itself. Soldiers burning images, monks defending relics, and saints protecting icons. These works served as historical memory preserved through art. They taught future generations to distrust imperial interference and to honor icons as sacred evidence of God's incarnation. Another consequence was the spiritualization of resistance. Icons acquired deeper symbolic meaning. They became signs of God's nearness and testimonies of human courage. Some icons were believed to have absorbed the prayers and tears of persecuted monks. Veneration thus became an act of historical remembrance, as well as theological devotion. monastic networks continued shaping Orthodox expansion outside Byzantium. Missionaries trained in Byzantine monasteries carried icon tradition into Bulgaria, Serbia, and Russia. These societies adopted icons as central expressions of national spirituality, proving that iconoclasm's defeat had global historic significance. Over time, monks also influenced secular art, inspiring new architectural forms such as the Athonite church design, with inward-focused layouts emphasizing mystical worship. They encouraged icon screens, fresco cycles, and illuminated manuscripts. Monastic art became synonymous with holy tradition. Ultimately, the monastic role in iconoclasm illustrates how spiritual conviction can defeat political power. Emperors commanded armies, but monks commanded belief. Their voices echoed across centuries, proving that truth is not determined by law or sword, but by perseverance rooted in faith. One of the most fascinating dimensions of Byzantine iconoclasm involves its dramatic impact on law, governance, and imperial authority. Iconoclasm did not unfold solely as a theological debate. It reshaped legal structures, redefined imperial power, and transformed the relationship between ruler and subject. In many ways, iconoclasm functioned as a constitutional crisis, where emperors attempted to rewrite the rules governing how doctrine was created, how dissent was punished, and how state ideology functioned. To understand this transformation, we must begin with the imperial ideal. Byzantine emperors believed they were chosen by God, responsible not only for political administration, but also for protecting religious truth. This concept, known as Caesaropapism, gave emperors extraordinary authority over church affairs. Before iconoclasm, imperial influence shaped ecumenical councils and theological policies, but the emperor rarely contradicted centuries of tradition. Under iconoclasm, however, emperors claimed a new form of spiritual jurisdiction. They asserted that they possessed wisdom to correct doctrinal errors through law alone. Leo III's initial icon legislation marked the start of this shift. His decision to remove the Chalkette Gate icon, punish protesters, and replace Patriarch Germanos revealed a new constitutional posture. Doctrine no longer required consensus. It required obedience. Leo used imperial edicts to announce theological decisions. Civil penalties accompanied religious prohibition, meaning that disagreeing with doctrine now constituted treason. This legal transformation intensified under Constantine V, who expanded iconoclasm into a fully codified state doctrine. His government issued laws restricting monasteries, banning public icon display, and authorizing property seizure. Imperial law courts prosecuted icon defenders, sentencing them to exile, imprisonment, or death. Constantine even used taxation policy to punish iconophile monasteries. Legal confiscation became a theological weapon. The Extraordinary Council of Hieria in 754 further pushed imperial power into ecclesiastical space. Although called a church council, it was shaped by imperial supervision and excluded patriarchs of major sees. Its rulings contained civil enforcement clauses, meaning violations were punishable by state courts. This blurred line between religious error and political treason. Legal consequences extended into family and inheritance matters. Some iconoclast emperors made it illegal to join monasteries without imperial permission, preventing wealthy families from donating estates to monasteries. The restriction protected imperial tax revenue and weakened monastic influence. Other laws forcibly married monks and nuns to break religious vows, redefining monastic autonomy in legal terms. Under Leo V in the Second Iconoclast period, imperial theology returned to law. Leo reissued icon bans and used civil courts to expel Patriarch Nikephoros. Civil power controlled spiritual leadership, demonstrating how iconoclasm became legal authoritarianism. Yet, iconoclasm also provoked legal resistance. Canon law defenders argued that emperors had exceeded rightful authority. They cited earlier councils, claiming only bishops could define doctrine. Their arguments preserved ecclesiastical independence and laid groundwork for future limits on imperial theological control. Iconoclasm also shaped imperial succession and legitimacy. Emperors used icon policy to differentiate themselves from predecessors and justify political coups. Irene restored icons to legitimize her regency. Leo V reinstated iconoclasm to justify overthrowing Michael I. Icon theology became political propaganda, influencing public loyalty. The end of iconoclasm marked a constitutional rebalancing. The triumph of orthodoxy reasserted that doctrine belonged to the church. Emperors after Theodora avoided legislating theology directly, recognizing iconoclasm had overreached. Imperial ceremonial changed too. Emperors included icons in coronation rituals to symbolize humility before church authority. In this sense, iconoclasm may be understood as a test of the Byzantine legal system. It revealed the empire's flexibility, its capacity for intellectual debate, and its danger of authoritarian excess. To explore iconoclasm's legal influence further, we must consider how imperial decrees affected everyday bureaucratic life. The Byzantine Empire maintained one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the medieval world. Tax registers, land surveys, city records, judicial archives, and elite legal schools like the Law Academy at Constantinople. When iconoclasm emerged, bureaucrats suddenly had to apply religious policy to legal documents. Property laws changed dramatically. Monks who resisted icon bans lost land under confiscation laws. In some cases, confiscated monastic property was transferred to military families loyal to the emperor. Legal redistribution shifted regional balance of power. Military aristocrats gained estates once owned by monasteries, creating new alliances between landholders and imperial authority. Legal education also encountered division. Students trained in Roman law traditionally studied Justinian's codices, which emphasized legal protocols separate from theology. Under iconoclasm, imperial ideology infiltrated law schools. Scholars wrote commentaries equating heresy with treason. Judicial philosophy became deeply theological. Judges studied not only secular legislation, but also scriptural passages used to justify icon prohibition. This merging of sacred and secular law had devastating consequences for legal fairness. Icon support became a criminal category separate from violent crime or theft. People accused of honoring icons could be tried in the same courts used to prosecute murderers or traitors. Imperial ceremonial changed too. Emperors included icons in coronation rituals to symbolize humility before church authority. In this sense, iconoclasm may be understood as a test of the Byzantine legal system. It revealed the empire's flexibility, its capacity for intellectual debate, and its danger of authoritarian excess. To explore iconoclasm's legal influence further, we must consider how imperial decrees affected everyday bureaucratic life. The Byzantine Empire maintained one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the medieval world. Tax registers, land surveys, city records, judicial archives, and elite legal schools like the Law Academy at Constantinople. When iconoclasm emerged, bureaucrats suddenly had to apply religious policy to legal documents. Property laws changed dramatically. Monks who resisted icon bans lost land under confiscation laws. In some cases, confiscated monastic property was transferred to military families loyal to the emperor. Legal redistribution shifted regional balance of power. Military aristocrats gained estates once owned by monasteries, creating new alliances between landholders and imperial authority. Legal education also encountered division. Students trained in Roman law traditionally studied Justinian's codices, which emphasized legal protocols separate from theology. Under iconoclasm, imperial ideology infiltrated law schools. Scholars wrote commentaries equating heresy with treason. Judicial philosophy became deeply theological. Judges studied not only secular legislation, but also scriptural passages used to justify icon prohibition. This merging of sacred and secular law had devastating consequences for legal fairness. Icon support became a criminal category separate from violent crime or theft. People accused of honoring icons could be tried in the same courts used to prosecute murderers or traitors. Witness testimony often came from political enemies or informants paid to reveal icon worship. Imperial police searched homes, monasteries, and libraries for illegal images. The legal system became a mechanism for fear. The second iconoclast period under Theophilos introduced surveillance policies. Regional governors received instructions to inspect churches for images and report offenders. Some governors abused authority, imprisoning rivals or seizing estates by accusing them of icon worship. Because icon possession was broadly defined, almost anyone could be targeted. However, iconoclasm also produced intellectual defenses of law. Iconophile canon lawyers wrote treatises arguing that the imperial court had no right to judge doctrinal cases. They appealed to ancient canon law. A council judges emperors, not emperors' councils. These writings articulated constitutional limits, rejecting Caesaropapism. Even after iconoclasm ended, legal memory shaped law. Monasteries demanded compensation for confiscated land. Church courts adjudicated property restoration cases for decades. Some secular aristocrats resisted giving land back, claiming imperial grants were permanent. These legal disputes forced emperors and patriarchs to collaborate, strengthening legal clarity between sacred and secular spheres. Iconoclasm also influenced criminal law indirectly. The brutality of punishments, mutilation, exile, torture, sparked later legal moderation. Byzantine judges developed a trend toward leniency in theological cases. After 843, ecclesiastical courts took responsibility for doctrinal crimes, reducing state violence. Finally, iconoclasm altered the symbolic function of law. During the controversy, emperors issued theological edicts resembling legal statutes. After its collapse, the empire distinguished between doctrinal declarations and civil law. This separation foreshadowed later European legal modernity, where church and state held distinct legal authority. Iconoclasm shattered this identity. Western Europe, especially under Charlemagne, used iconoclasm to delegitimize Byzantine imperial theology, asserting the Franks as true defenders of Christianity. Western kings used imagery publicly in coronations, contrasting Byzantine destruction with Frankish preservation. This ideological competition influenced military alliances. Italy drifted away from Byzantine influence. The papacy refused to support Byzantine armies in Sicily or southern Italy, contributing to Muslim advances. Iconoclasm, therefore, indirectly weakened frontier defense. Military morale recovered only after icon restoration. Psychologically, restored icons rekindled hope among troops battling Arabs and Bulgars. Believers again felt protected. Icons returned to shields, weapons, and helmets. As centuries passed, the memory of iconoclasm shaped military identity. Byzantine soldiers embraced icons so fiercely that later crusaders from Western Europe noted Eastern armies carrying more religious images than weapons. Military culture became deeply iconic in reaction to iconoclasm. In conclusion, the military dimension demonstrates that iconoclasm was never a purely theological conflict. It penetrated the deepest layers of power: training, hierarchy, loyalty, weapon symbolism, strategic morale, and battlefield worldview. The army shaped iconoclasm, and iconoclasm reshaped the army. Byzantine iconoclasm may have ended in 843, but its consequences continued shaping religious identity, artistic expression, political power, and philosophical thought across centuries. Its influence even extended far beyond Byzantium, leaving fingerprints on the development of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Christian world. To understand iconoclasm's legacy, we must explore how cultures remembered it, how it influenced future controversies, how it changed global religious art, and how it reshaped Christian self-understanding. After the triumph of orthodoxy, Byzantium carefully crafted memory narratives around iconoclasm. The empire did not treat it merely as a historical mistake. It framed the controversy as a divine drama. Historical writing reimagined iconoclast emperors as villains blinded by pride, while icon defenders, monks, priests, and ordinary believers became spiritual heroes. This narrative shaped how Byzantine society interpreted suffering and triumph. Icons came to symbolize not just holiness, but perseverance against oppression. Because icons had survived destruction, people believed the faith itself was indestructible. This memory had psychological consequences. Byzantines developed religious confidence rooted in martyrdom identity. They believed the truth could withstand any emperor, army, or ideology. Later persecutions, whether from crusaders or Ottoman invaders, were interpreted through iconoclasm's lens. The event had trained Byzantium to think theologically about crisis. God tests his people through suffering. Iconoclasm also solidified Orthodox theology forever. Before the controversy, icon doctrine was culturally accepted but never comprehensively articulated. Afterward, icon theology became a cornerstone of orthodoxy, the belief that matter participates in divine reality. Icons affirmed that God truly became human. Therefore, the physical world could reveal holiness. This theology shaped the sacramental worldview, distinguishing Eastern Christianity from Western Protestantism centuries later. Without iconoclasm, Eastern Christianity might not have developed such a strong theological foundation for visual sacredness. Politically, iconoclasm weakened Byzantium's unity with the Latin West. Rome condemned iconoclasm passionately, causing the papacy to turn toward the Frankish kingdom for protection. This alliance paved the way for the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. When Charlemagne crowned himself emperor, he challenged Byzantine imperial exclusivity. Thus, iconoclasm indirectly helped divide Europe politically. Two Roman worlds emerged instead of one. Culturally, iconoclasm influenced art history far beyond Byzantium's borders. The Renaissance revival of icon painting in Russia, Italy, and Greece occurred because icons had become symbols of deep theological meaning, not just decoration. Western artists later studied icon perspective, discovering reverse perspective and theological symbolism. Icons inspired surrealism, modernist spirituality, and religious expression across denominations. Iconoclasm also shaped Islamic, Christian artistic relations. Muslims rejected icons but developed calligraphy, geometric ornamentation, and abstract symbolism. Byzantine artists, resisting total abstraction, created art that balanced symbolic stylization with figural representation. This artistic difference influenced world art development profoundly. Finally, iconoclasm shaped philosophical thought about images themselves. Later debates about photography, film, and digital imagery trace back to fundamental questions raised during iconoclasm. What do images do to the mind? Can images distort truth? Do images control memory? These questions matter today in an age shaped by media and technology. Thus, iconoclasm's legacy cannot be limited to medieval history. It influenced psychology, national identity, global theology, visual culture, politics, and modern philosophy. The controversy tested the limits of human resistance and proved that belief systems survive through memory, not power. To fully explore iconoclasm's long-term influence on world cultures, we must examine how its memory shaped societies beyond Byzantium, especially Slavic Orthodox cultures, Western medieval institutions, and even modern global Christianity. In Eastern Europe, iconoclasm left an artistic and spiritual imprint that still defines Slavic identity. When Orthodoxy spread into Bulgaria, Serbia, and the lands of Kievan Rus, missionaries carried not only scripture, but icon theology forged through iconoclasm. Russians received icons not as artistic novelties, but as sacred survivors of oppression. The very origin story of Russian Christianity Prince Vladimir's conversion in 988 drew heavily upon Byzantine visual spirituality. He rejected Islam partly because it forbade icons, and rejected Catholicism partly because it lacked the mystical visual depth he witnessed in Constantinople. Thus, iconoclasm indirectly determined the religious future of Eastern Europe. Later, Russian icons became masterpieces. Andrei Rublev's Trinity, Novgorod frescoes, and Ukrainian mosaic traditions evolved because icon theology had survived. When Mongol invasions devastated Rus, icons helped communities preserve faith and culture. The same memory dynamic occurred again under Soviet atheism. Icons became underground symbols of resistance. Without iconoclasm's legacy, Slavic Christianity might have expressed faith differently, through text or statue rather than painted iconography. In the Latin West, iconoclasm indirectly fueled intellectual rivalry. When the Franks wrote the Libri Carolini criticizing icons, they misunderstood the theology but still stimulated debate about representation. Later, Western Christianity embraced sculpture and stained glass, creating cathedrals filled with three-dimensional saints that mirrored but differed from Byzantine icons. This divergence deepened artistic identity differences between East and West. Iconoclasm even influenced the Protestant Reformation. 600 years later, reformers such as Zwingli and Calvin revived iconoclastic arguments. They rejected images as idolatry, quoting biblical critiques similar to Leo III. Protestant iconoclasm destroyed medieval statues throughout Europe. The echoes of Byzantine iconoclasm reached across centuries because the original controversy had provided arguments, categories, and fears. However, Catholic response to Protestant iconoclasm also mirrored Byzantine iconophile theology. The Council of Trent defended religious art by referencing incarnational logic. Without Byzantine iconoclasm, Reformation visual debates would have lacked historical depth. Iconoclasm also affected Islamic Christian relations. Muslim polemicists used Byzantine iconoclasm to argue Islam had superior theological clarity. Medieval Islamic scholars pointed to Byzantine conflict as evidence of Christian inconsistency. Ironically, the defeat of iconoclasm enabled Byzantines to respond confidently. We resolved our crisis. You remain separated from our sacramental understanding. Icon theology became an interfaith boundary marker. Modern Orthodox spirituality inherits psychological patterns from iconoclasm. Icons are treated not simply as objects of piety, but as bearers of historical trauma. Many Orthodox believers consider icon veneration an expression of identity, proof that Orthodoxy survived foreign pressure, whether Islamic conquests, crusades, communist atheism, or globalization. Iconography today reflects this heritage through themes of struggle and endurance. Iconoclasm also shaped academic scholarship. Historians still debate the real motivations behind it: religious sincerity, imperial propaganda, Islamic influence, political centralization, or economic redistribution. Because the sources were written primarily by iconophiles, historians must decode bias and reconstruct lost perspectives. The controversy became a methodological challenge for modern researchers. Furthermore, artistic historians study post-iconoclast art to understand how trauma shapes creativity. Iconoclast destruction forced artists to innovate. New pigment techniques, new icon forms, and new theological symbols emerged because artists had to rebuild tradition. The gold backgrounds, elongated proportions, and mystical shadows of Byzantine iconography reflect a culture transformed by loss and rebirth. Thus, iconoclasm shaped world cultures profoundly. It redirected Slavic religion. It influenced European artistic evolution. It empowered Reformation icon debates. It affected Islamic polemics. It defined Orthodox identity. It shaped historical research methods. The legacy is not confined to Byzantium. It traveled across continents and centuries. To conclude this 20-part study, we must bring together the threads of iconoclasm's immense historical significance. The controversy was more than a religious disagreement. It was a crucible that forged Eastern Christian civilization. Through icon destruction and restoration, Byzantium learned who it was and who it was not. Theologically, iconoclasm clarified that Christianity is inseparable from incarnation. If God truly became human, then human nature, flesh, emotion, form, and body could be depicted. Without incarnation theology, Christianity risks abstraction. Iconoclasm forced theologians to define belief with precision, shaping doctrines that still endure. Politically, the controversy permanently weakened Caesaropapism. Emperors learned that seizing control of doctrine could destroy legitimacy rather than strengthen it. After 843, the Church gained greater independence. Later Byzantine emperors seldom attempted to reshape doctrine through imperial decree. Iconoclasm, therefore, strengthened institutional church identity. Culturally, iconoclasm carved visual art into orthodoxy's bones. Icons emerged from the controversy not as decorative objects, but as sacred necessities. It suppressed manuscripts, but inspired new writing. It fractured schools, but strengthened monastic resilience. The result was a more self-aware, scholarly world that recognized the value of memory and tradition. The second iconoclast period, 815 to 843, brought even deeper educational complexity. Unlike the first phase, which relied heavily on military coercion, the second engaged directly with scholarship and academic thought. Emperor Theophilos, educated and intelligent, supported classical learning and philosophy. He commissioned translations of Arabic scientific texts, funded mathematics, and encouraged artistic experimentation. However, his reign also enforced iconoclasm with scholarly justification, shaping education into ideological warfare. Under Theophilos, schools in Constantinople prioritized Aristotelian logic to defend iconoclast theology. John the Grammarian served as patriarch and intellectual architect. He trained elite theologians to challenge icons through syllogisms, linguistic analysis, and metaphysical reasoning. While we may disagree with their conclusions, iconoclast scholars undeniably elevated academic standards, refining Byzantine philosophy. They asked hard questions. What is representation? What is essence? Can matter contain the divine? Their debate pushed orthodox thinkers to articulate clearer metaphysics. Meanwhile, monastic education persisted underground. Monks copied manuscripts secretly, hiding theological works beneath floorboards, behind fresco panels, or within double book covers. Some texts were smuggled to Italy or Sinai for preservation. Without these covert networks, many patristic works might have disappeared. Yet, iconoclasm damaged intellectual culture through censorship. Anti-icon emperors banned certain hymns, sermons, and theological commentaries. Chant schools were forced to remove references to saints shown in icons. The Studite monastery, once a hub of scholarly creativity, suffered closure orders and exile. Theodore the Studite's teachings survived only through careful memorization by disciples who reconstructed texts after restoration. Educational decline also affected the general population. Without icons, church instruction relied on preaching and catechesis alone. But many towns lacked educated priests capable of teaching abstract theology. Literacy declined among poorer communities. Children raised during iconoclasm received little exposure to visual biblical history. Some historians believe this created a cultural scar, a generation spiritually undernourished by lack of imagery. Yet the intellectual backlash after iconoclasm was profound. When icons returned, Byzantine scholarship exploded in what historians call the Macedonian Renaissance. Classical texts resurfaced, scriptoria revived, grammar and rhetoric schools flourished, art academies re-emerged. Why? Because iconoclasm had sharpened hunger for knowledge. Centuries of fear gave way to centuries of learning. Educational thinkers reflected on iconoclasm's lessons. They argued that theological error stems partly from ignorance. Therefore, they built stronger educational institutions to protect orthodoxy. Monasteries expanded libraries. Court scholars produced encyclopedias. Bishops trained clergy systematically, ensuring that preaching aligned with correct doctrine. The intellectual renewal restored late antique heritage. Works by Plato and Aristotle returned to curricular prominence. Students learned logical reasoning not to destroy icons, but to defend them. Byzantine scholars produced commentaries blending classical philosophy with Christian theology, creating a uniquely Eastern intellectual identity. Thus, iconoclasm paradoxically accelerated academic maturation. It forced Byzantium to reconsider what education meant, not simply memorizing scripture, but understanding faith through reason, history, art, and culture. Iconoclasm wounded the scholarly world, but the wounds healed into intellectual strength. When examining iconoclasm's long-term intellectual consequences, we must consider how it influenced identity, scholarship, and future Orthodox philosophy. Iconoclasm taught Byzantium that knowledge, not just power, shapes civilization. After a century of theological turmoil, Byzantines came to view education as spiritual armor. Manuscripts were not only books, they were shields. Libraries became sanctuaries of memory. This intellectual shift had global influence. After iconoclasm ended, Byzantine scholars trained missionaries to evangelize Slavic regions. These missionaries, such as Cyril and Methodius, developed the Glagolitic alphabet, laying foundations for Slavic literacy. Their mission succeeded because they carried books and icons, teaching people to read scripture through art and language. Without the intellectual revival triggered by iconoclasm's defeat, these missions might never have occurred, potentially altering Eastern European history. Another legacy involves historical writing. Post-iconoclast chroniclers documented events with new urgency. They wrote biographies of icon defenders, polemics against imperial tyranny, and accounts of suffering. Their writings shaped Byzantine collective memory forever. History became theological narrative. Triumph over iconoclasm symbolized triumph over falsehood. Iconoclasm also inspired philosophical exploration. What is beauty? What is memory? What is holiness? What is representation? These questions forged new academic disciplines within Byzantine universities, blending aesthetics, theology, and psychology. Scholars also reflected on cognitive learning. They realized icons aided memory retention. Visual association allowed worshippers to remember scripture effortlessly. Removing icons weakened intellectual retention among lay believers. Post-iconoclast educators used icons to reinforce learning, shaping Orthodox pedagogy permanently. Moreover, iconoclasm altered attitudes toward classical pagan learning. During the crisis, some emperors feared that philosophical texts promoted idolatry. After Restoration, scholars reinterpreted classical thought through Christian lenses. Plato's theory of forms and Aristotle's metaphysics became tools to explain icon theology. The empire recovered ancient knowledge with new confidence. Iconoclasm also reshaped book culture. Before the controversy, manuscript illumination flourished. After Restoration, illumination evolved with richer symbolism. Swirling foliage represented eternal life. Gold borders symbolized divine grace, and miniature saints decorated margins. The trauma of missing icons pushed artists to fill books with beauty, turning each manuscript into a portable church. Through education, Byzantium also reasserted independence from the West. Icon theology became intellectual boundary between Latin scholasticism and Eastern apophatic tradition. While the West later embraced philosophical realism and sculpture, Byzantium embraced symbolic abstraction and mystical iconography. Iconoclasm helped define these separate paths. Finally, iconoclasm shaped Byzantine self-awareness. It reminded scholars that knowledge must stand above imperial command. The empire learned that rulers come and go, but truth remains embodied in scripture, tradition, and learning. Thus, education became an act of resistance, a safeguard against future heresy. To understand the full magnitude of Byzantine iconoclasm, we must examine its impact on cultural psychology and collective identity. Iconoclasm was not simply a dispute over artistic practice. It was a crisis that penetrated emotional life, reshaped memory, and altered how Byzantines perceived themselves within the Christian world. The conflict carved itself into the empire's cultural DNA, leaving psychological imprints that influenced future generations long after political battles ended. Byzantine identity before iconoclasm rested on continuity with the Roman past, shared beliefs in imperial order, and spiritual devotion expressed through ritual and imagery. Icons played a critical role in shaping religious worldview. They acted as visual companions guiding daily life, hanging above beds, marking doorways, protecting travelers, and appearing in shop walls and marketplaces. To remove icons, therefore, meant removing identity markers. The emotional reaction to icon destruction reveals a profound attachment. Chroniclers describe collective weeping when icons were removed from city gates. Families carried images in procession to protect them from soldiers. When possible, believers buried icons as if burying martyrs, wrapping them in cloth and sealing them beneath altars. These actions demonstrate that icon veneration was not merely an intellectual position. It was a deeply emotional cultural practice. Iconoclasm also produced trauma rooted in betrayal. For centuries, Byzantines believed their empire existed under divine protection. Removing icons symbolized removing God's presence. When earthquakes, plagues, or military defeats occurred, iconophiles interpreted them as divine punishment for icon destruction. Conversely, iconoclasts used disasters to claim that idolatry had weakened the empire. This battle for theological interpretation intensified emotional wounds. They served as theology, memory, and worship simultaneously. The restoration of icons is remembered not only as a return of imagery, but as a return of identity. Psychologically, iconoclasm taught Byzantium that truth survives through suffering. Emperors burned icons, tortured monks, exiled bishops, confiscated land, and censored thought, yet icons survived. Monks secretly copied manuscripts. Women hid icons in textiles. Peasants buried them. Soldiers preserved fragments in armor. This cultural memory of defiance shaped Orthodox mentality for centuries. Socially, iconoclasm reshaped family and communal structure. It fractured trust, created generational trauma, then rebuilt community through shared ritual. It changed how people prayed at home, how children learned stories, and how society expressed grief. Economically, iconoclasm redirected wealth, reshaped markets, empowered aristocrats, destabilized villages, and ultimately revived artisan culture through post-843 artistic explosion. Internationally, iconoclasm altered alliances, weakened Byzantine control in Italy, strengthened the Frankish West, shaped Slavic Christian formation, and influenced Islamic, Christian intellectual relations. Artistically, iconoclasm broke earlier stylistic stagnation, forcing creative rebirth. The post-iconoclast period produced some of the greatest works of Orthodox art ever painted. Educationally, iconoclasm damaged manuscript preservation, then inspired Byzantine Renaissance learning. Books lost became books remade, pushing scholars to catalog, classify, and preserve text more intentionally than before. Militarily, iconoclasm changed army identity, strategy, and morale, eventually proving dangerous when emperors attached battlefield success to theology. Philosophically, iconoclasm forced Christians to ask eternal questions about imagery, truth, embodiment, and knowledge, questions that echo in modern conversations about media, religion, and culture. Another psychological dimension emerged from generational identity. Children raised during iconoclasm grew up seeing bare church walls, hearing sermons warning against images, and associating icons with danger. When icons were restored, these children faced cultural shock. Their parents celebrated imagery they had been taught to avoid. Such generational clashes produced hybrid religious identities. Some accepted icons easily, others viewed them suspiciously. This diverse reaction shows that iconoclasm created internal diversity within Byzantine culture. Through memory, iconoclasm shaped national narrative. After restoration, Byzantines mythologized the controversy, framing icon defenders as heroes and icon destroyers as villains. Constantine V, once admired by the army, transformed into a demonic tyrant in iconophile biographies. His military successes were erased from memory or reinterpreted as demonic illusions. Meanwhile, Irene, once criticized for blinding her son, emerged as a saintly heroine. This rewriting demonstrates how societies reshape memory to heal trauma. Public ritual reinforced identity. Every year, the Orthodox Church celebrates the triumph of orthodoxy on the first Sunday of Lent. During this celebration, priests read the Synodicon, proclamations condemning iconoclast teachings and praising icon defenders. These annual readings ensured that iconoclasm never faded from memory. Instead, the event became a foundational narrative teaching that truth triumphs over imperial oppression. Iconoclasm also affected Byzantine humor and folklore. Jokes circulated mocking iconoclast emperors as foolish tyrants who attempted to fight paint and wood. Folk tales depicted icons miraculously escaping fire, flying through the air, or bleeding when attacked. These stories strengthened belief that icons were alive with divine power. Finally, iconoclasm produced a cultural dialectic. Byzantines began to define themselves not only by what they believed, but by what they rejected. They rejected Islamic aniconism, pagan idolatry, Jewish monotheistic criticism, and Western papal interference. Icons became symbols of Eastern Christian independence. Identity sharpened through contrast. Thus, iconoclasm transformed Byzantine emotional life, reshaping how individuals connected with faith, family, history, and the world. The social psychology of iconoclasm reveals how religious conflict molds memory and shapes emotional interpretation across centuries. One major consequence was the evolution of martyr culture. During iconoclasm, monks, nuns, clergy, and lay people suffered for defending icons. Their stories circulated orally, then appeared in written biographies. These narratives portrayed icon defenders as fearless warriors confronting tyrants. Over time, these martyr tales reinforced orthodox values of perseverance and sacrifice. Families told stories of ancestors imprisoned for icons, creating intergenerational pride. Children grew up believing their lineage was tied to heroic resistance. This turned memory into identity, shaping how people saw themselves in relation to faith and empire. Iconoclasm also influenced emotional expression through liturgy. Post-iconoclast hymns mourned the pain of icon absence and celebrated restoration. Hymnographers described the church as a grieving mother whose children were lost during iconoclasm and returned through miracles. This metaphorical language nurtured emotional solidarity among believers. Furthermore, the trauma of iconoclasm altered Byzantium's political imagination. Citizens lost trust in imperial infallibility. Before iconoclasm, emperors were seen as God's representatives on earth. Afterward, people realized imperial power could be spiritually mistaken. This attitude survived into later centuries, generating skepticism toward emperors who deviated from tradition. Another consequence was increased emphasis on visible holiness. Because iconoclasm denied the legitimacy of sacred images, post-843 Byzantines reacted by exaggerating icon presence. Churches multiplied their icons, covering walls, ceilings, floors, and icon screens. Homes displayed icons in every room. Processions featured icons on banners and staffs. Pilgrims traveled across provinces to visit miraculous images. This proliferation served two functions. First, it marked triumph over suppression. Second, it ensured iconoclasm could never return. Cultural trauma manifested as visual abundance. Icon restoration also changed sensibilities about beauty. Byzantines began associating beauty with truth. If something was spiritually pure, it should also be aesthetically magnificent. Icon frames became gilded with jewels. Mosaics glittered in gold tesserae. Icon painters used richer pigments, lapis lazuli, vermilion, and realgar, to evoke divine presence. The result was a civilization enthralled by sacred beauty. Iconoclasm also reshaped public speech. Before the controversy, theological disagreement occurred largely within elite circles. After iconoclasm, doctrinal debate entered daily conversation. Marketplaces buzzed with argument. Soldiers debated icons in barracks. Women whispered theology in kitchens. Religious literacy increased because theology entered common vocabulary. Another emotional legacy involved fear. Some Byzantines believed iconoclasm brought divine punishment in the form of military defeat. Stories circulated that Arab armies succeeded only after icons were removed. Even centuries later, Byzantine soldiers carried icons into battle to prevent another iconoclast curse. This fear intertwined with national myth. By the time of the Macedonian emperors, iconoclasm became a warning embedded in cultural consciousness. Do not repeat the sins of the iconoclasts. In summary, iconoclasm shaped identity through martyrdom, celebration, distrust of power, visual abundance, and myth creation. These psychological legacies illustrate that iconoclasm did not end in 843. It continued to shape Byzantine emotional life for generations. Beyond emotional and cultural psychology, iconoclasm altered the philosophical foundations of Byzantine self-perception. The controversy forced Byzantines to define what it meant to be human, what it meant to believe, and what it meant to see truth. This philosophical impact is among iconoclasm's most enduring contributions to world thought. The central debate, whether matter could reflect the divine, reshaped metaphysical identity. Iconoclasts believed God transcended physical imagery and that matter corrupted spiritual understanding. Iconophiles believed incarnation sanctified matter, making physical representation not only possible but essential. This debate influenced anthropology. Iconophiles taught that humans carry divine image within their bodies. This doctrine elevated human dignity. Without iconoclasm, theological anthropology may have remained abstract. Through conflict, it became cultural conviction. The controversy also shaped epistemology, how knowledge is formed. Iconophiles argued humans need visible forms to understand invisible truths. They insisted that faith enters the intellect through the senses. Icons provided memory anchors, helping people recall biblical events. Iconoclasts countered that spiritual truth exists beyond sense perception. Their emphasis on invisible worship influenced future mystical theology. These clashes sparked intellectual creativity. Byzantine thinkers developed arguments about representation, symbolism, and semiotics long before these disciplines emerged in modern philosophy. They explored why humans trust images, how symbols convey meaning, and why visual memory shapes belief. Another philosophical question concerned time. Iconoclasts believed images froze moments improperly, claiming saints were alive spiritually and should not be confined by art. Iconophiles responded that icons transcend time, connecting believers to eternity. This argument reframed icons as portals linking earthly worship with heavenly liturgy. Identity also crystallized around suffering. Byzantines interpreted iconoclasm as spiritual trials sent by God. When they survived the struggle, they viewed themselves as purified. This purification narrative shaped collective self-esteem. By surviving destruction, Byzantium believed it earned divine favor. Furthermore, iconoclasm shaped Byzantine understanding of history itself. Post-iconoclast society believed that history revealed God's will. Events were interpreted not only politically, but spiritually. Military victory or defeat became theological messages. This worldview influenced how later emperors governed and how future historians wrote. Philosophically, iconoclasm strengthened belief in community memory. Byzantines concluded that truth survives through tradition, through stories, rituals, and icons passed between generations. They learned that destroying physical images could not erase memory. Memory lived in people. Finally, iconoclasm redefined Byzantine identity against foreign cultures. Islam forbade figural imagery. Judaism rejected divine incarnation. Latin Christianity embraced sculpture and papal authority. Byzantium positioned itself between these worlds, claiming a unique spiritual path expressed visually through icons. Identity emerged through differentiation. In conclusion, iconoclasm permanently shaped how Byzantines thought, felt, remembered, and believed. It turned theology into culture, culture into memory, and memory into identity. While much of Byzantine iconoclasm has been studied through imperial politics, theological treatises, and institutional conflict, the movement also had profound effects on everyday life. Understanding how ordinary people experienced iconoclasm provides an essential window into the social history of the empire. The crisis was not confined to palaces, monasteries, or episcopal chambers. It entered kitchens, workshops, farmhouses, fishing villages, merchant guilds, and marketplaces. It reached the hearts of sailors and shepherds, mothers and soldiers, children and the elderly. Iconoclasm restructured how individuals prayed, how families taught beliefs, and how communities built trust. Before iconoclasm, icons permeated domestic life. Families kept small icon shrines near doorways, believing the images protected their home from evil spirits, illness, or catastrophe. Parents prayed before icons with children, and elderly women whispered prayers in front of favorite saints at sunrise. Icons acted as emotional companions. Soldiers carried small icons into battle, believing saints stood beside them on the battlefield. Farmers prayed before icons for good harvests and rain. Women prayed before childbirth icons for safe delivery. Icons were embedded into life's major transitions. Marriage blessings, funerals, baptisms, and illness rituals involved imagery. When emperors removed icons from public worship, ordinary believers reacted emotionally and practically. Their spiritual routines collapsed overnight. Households accustomed to beginning meals with prayers before the Virgin's image now found emptiness on the wall. Byzantium positioned itself between these worlds, claiming a unique spiritual path expressed visually through icons. Identity emerged through differentiation. In conclusion, iconoclasm permanently shaped how Byzantines thought, felt, remembered, and believed. It turned theology into culture, culture into memory, and memory into identity. While much of Byzantine iconoclasm has been studied through imperial politics, theological treatises, and institutional conflict, the movement also had profound effects on everyday life. Understanding how ordinary people experienced iconoclasm provides an essential window into the social history of the empire. The crisis was not confined to palaces, monasteries, or episcopal chambers. It entered kitchens, workshops, farmhouses, fishing villages, merchant guilds, and marketplaces. It reached the hearts of sailors and shepherds, mothers and soldiers, children and the elderly. Iconoclasm restructured how individuals prayed, how families taught beliefs, and how communities built trust. Before iconoclasm, icons permeated domestic life. Families kept small icon shrines near doorways, believing the images protected their home from evil spirits, illness, or catastrophe. Parents prayed before icons with children, and elderly women whispered prayers in front of favorite saints at sunrise. Icons acted as emotional companions. Soldiers carried small icons into battle, believing saints stood beside them on the battlefield. Farmers prayed before icons for good harvests and rain. Women prayed before childbirth icons for safe delivery. Icons were embedded into life's major transitions. Marriage blessings, funerals, baptisms, and illness rituals involved imagery. When emperors removed icons from public worship, ordinary believers reacted emotionally and practically. Their spiritual routines collapsed overnight. Households accustomed to beginning meals with prayers before the Virgin's image now found emptiness on the wall. Children who grew up talking to icons before sleep were suddenly told to stop. Parents struggled to explain the change. Were icons sinful? Why had the emperor changed God's rules? These questions reached deep into emotional security and worldview. Popular religion also blended Christianity with folk customs. Many Byzantine villagers believed saints intervened daily in the natural world, protecting livestock, calming storms, or preventing disease. Saints were recognized through icons. Their faces, gestures, and attributes identified them. Without icons, these saints lost recognizable form. Villagers worried. How could they call upon Saint George without knowing his image? In some homes, people hid icons behind curtains or under beds. They whispered prayers quietly to avoid being reported. Children became secret guardians of icons, asked to watch for soldiers or informants approaching homes. Oral poetry of the period recalls children weeping when icons were taken from schools. This illustrates how iconoclasm shaped childhood memory. Popular pilgrimage practices suffered too. Before iconoclasm, pilgrims traveled to monasteries to venerate wonder-working icons believed to heal illness or grief. These journeys provided communal bonding across social class and region. When iconoclast emperors banned icons, pilgrimage shrines lost significance. Local economies built around pilgrimage. Inns, mule rentals, small shops, and food vendors declined. The removal of icons also harmed literacy. Many villagers learned biblical stories visually. Without icons, priests needed to teach scripture verbally through lengthy sermons. But because rural priests were often poorly educated, sermons sometimes confused doctrine. Icon removal, therefore, decreased religious understanding among rural populations. Additionally, fear spread. Imperial spies were rumored to travel village to village seeking hidden icons. Even if these rumors exaggerated reality, fear shaped behavior. People self-censored speech. Some individuals publicly destroyed icons to avoid suspicion, even if they cried in private. Others betrayed neighbors to gain imperial favor or remove rivals. Iconoclasm, thus, created an atmosphere of distrust within communities. Yet, the crisis also sparked solidarity. Villagers united to protect favorite icons, burying them, smuggling them to monasteries, or hiding them inside walls. These acts of resistance fostered collective identity. Families remembered the heroism of grandparents who protected icons during the dark years, cementing memory into family tradition. Thus, iconoclasm disrupted everyday life profoundly, altering domestic ritual, emotional security, and social cohesion. The conflict reached places untouched by imperial politics, reshaping popular faith permanently. Another major dimension of iconoclasm's impact on daily life lies in the restructuring of family relationships. Byzantine families were deeply religious units, relying on icons to teach morality, identity, and intergenerational loyalty. Icon removal destabilized this structure. Parents had to decide whether to follow imperial law or preserve family tradition. Children experienced confusion during crucial developmental years. Grandparents struggled to transmit cultural memory under political threat. In urban settings where literacy was higher, families preserved icon memory through storytelling rather than imagery. Parents told tales about saints that used to hang on their walls, describing colors, shapes, and miracles. These invisible icons existed only through words. Children raised during iconoclasm grew up associating religious imagery with secrecy. This secrecy shaped interpersonal trust. The distinction between family truth and state truth became ingrained. Family conflict emerged between generations. Older family members who had lived with icons refused to abandon memory, while younger members sometimes became loyal to iconoclast ideology taught in schools and barracks. These generational fractures resemble psychological trauma seen in societies under totalitarian pressure. A child supporting the emperor's theology might accuse a parent of icon worship. Some historical accounts describe children unintentionally betraying family members to authorities. Women occupied central roles in icon preservation. Because they controlled household space, women hid icons beneath floorboards, beneath embroidered pillows, or inside clay jars stored with grain. Some embroidered icon motifs into clothing or linens, disguising sacred imagery as decoration. Women used weaving patterns to encode symbols of saints, ensuring icon memory survived through daily textiles. Marriage rituals changed drastically. Before iconoclasm, icons blessed wedding ceremonies, symbolizing divine presence in family formation. Icon removal stripped weddings of visual spiritual authority. Couples married under bare church domes, without the Virgin or Christ overseeing vows. This emotional absence changed marriage psychology. Some couples secretly carried small icon scraps sewn into wedding garments, believing the icon strengthened marital fidelity. Birth and childhood also changed. Infant cradles traditionally held icons of guardian angels or the Theotokos, Virgin Mary. Without icons, families placed crosses or scriptural scrolls instead. While still sacred, these objects lacked emotional intimacy. Mothers reported feeling less spiritually supported during childbirth. Midwives, often deeply religious women, hid icons in delivery rooms for comfort. Family conflict emerged between generations. Older family members who had lived with icons refused to abandon memory, while younger members sometimes became loyal to iconoclast ideology taught in schools and barracks. These generational fractures resemble psychological trauma seen in societies under totalitarian pressure. A child supporting the emperor's theology might accuse a parent of icon worship. Some historical accounts describe children unintentionally betraying family members to authorities. Women occupied central roles in icon preservation. Because they controlled household space, women hid icons beneath floorboards, beneath embroidered pillows, or inside clay jars stored with grain. Some embroidered icon motifs into clothing or linens, disguising sacred imagery as decoration. Women used weaving patterns to encode symbols of saints, ensuring icon memory survived through daily textiles. Marriage rituals changed drastically. Before iconoclasm, icons blessed wedding ceremonies, symbolizing divine presence in family formation. Icon removal stripped weddings of visual spiritual authority. Couples married under bare church domes, without the Virgin or Christ overseeing vows. This emotional absence changed marriage psychology. Some couples secretly carried small icon scraps sewn into wedding garments, believing the icon strengthened marital fidelity. Birth and childhood also changed. Infant cradles traditionally held icons of guardian angels or the Theotokos, Virgin Mary. Without icons, families placed crosses or scriptural scrolls instead. While still sacred, these objects lacked emotional intimacy. Mothers reported feeling less spiritually supported during childbirth. Midwives, often deeply religious women, hid icons in delivery rooms for comfort. Death rituals suffered too. Funeral icons depicting Christ and saints were banned. Families mourned beside blank shrouds instead of images symbolizing eternal hope. This diminished ritual color and comfort. In some villages, priests risked punishment to sneak icons into homes for dying parishioners, believing the departing soul needed visual aid. The emotional toll of these losses shaped Byzantine personality. Post-iconoclast culture emerged deeply protective of icons because they symbolized lost intimacy. Icons became not just religious items, but vessels of memory linking family past and future. At the communal level, icon veneration once structured social hierarchy. Neighborhoods held processions honoring local patron saints whose icons led the parade. During iconoclasm, these festivals were canceled or altered. Public space felt empty, lacking the pageantry that shaped city identity. Despite imperial enforcement, resistance flourished. Families formed underground icon circles, groups meeting secretly to view or venerate a single hidden icon. These gatherings resembled spiritual resistance movements. They kept prayer life alive and forged strong emotional bonds across families. Such evidence reveals that iconoclasm transformed family psychology, reshaping patterns of love, loyalty, ritual, secrecy, and generational memory. To fully understand how iconoclasm reshaped daily life, we must examine popular religion, the faith practiced outside the walls of formal theology. Popular religion was not necessarily doctrinally precise. It blended Christian belief with ancient superstition, folk medicine, ancestral ritual, and local legend. Icons functioned as bridges between official theology and popular spirituality. Destroying icons therefore fractured cultural identity at grassroots levels. In the end, the iconoclast controversy became a defining chapter in global religious history. It reshaped civilizations, not just doctrines. It left behind not ruins, but foundations. It demonstrated that images are not neutral. They shape identity, belief, memory, and imagination. Today, icons continue to inspire prayer and art worldwide. They sit in cathedrals, monasteries, museums, and homes, silent witnesses to the storms of history they survived. Their endurance reflects humanity's longing to see meaning, not only to think it. And so, Byzantine iconoclasm, born in conflict, sustained by power, ended by faith, remains one of history's greatest testimonies to the enduring relationship between image and soul. Before iconoclasm, icons acted as mediators between heaven and earth. They personalized faith. Saints depicted in icons were seen as neighbors who listened and responded. Peasants prayed to icon images during droughts, believing the saints could open the heavens. Fishermen prayed to seafaring saints during storms. Sailors carved icon images into oars and masts. Children saw icons as protectors from nightmares. When icons disappeared, people sought alternative spiritual methods. Some turned to relics. Fragments of bone, cloth, or hair became substitutes. Others used charms with crosses or biblical verses. While still Christian, these substitutes lacked emotional richness and visual storytelling. Folk religion also adapted through oral performance. Villagers recited chants describing saints' faces, turning imagery into song. These chants preserved icon identity without physical presence. Rural priests encouraged songs when icons were banned, using memory as resistance. Another aspect of popular religion involved miracle expectation. Some icons were believed to bleed, cry, or release fragrant scent. These phenomena reinforced spiritual presence. Iconoclasm destroyed access to miracles, creating spiritual depression. Without icons, villagers doubted whether saints still intervened. Emotional confusion led some people to reinterpret dreams. They believed saints visited them through visions to replace lost images. Dream iconography became a new spiritual language. Popular religion also used icons to resolve disputes. Villagers swore oaths before icons to ensure honesty. Removing icons weakened oath culture. Without the visual presence of saints, legal trust eroded. People questioned fairness in trade, property rights, and neighborly agreements. Icon destruction also influenced magic practices. Some individuals turned to amulets, astrology, or pagan remnants. Before iconoclasm, icons acted as mediators between heaven and earth. They personalized faith. Saints depicted in icons were seen as neighbors who listened and responded. Peasants prayed to icon images during droughts, believing the saints could open the heavens. Fishermen prayed to seafaring saints during storms. Sailors carved icon images into oars and masts. Children saw icons as protectors from nightmares. When icons disappeared, people sought alternative spiritual methods. Some turned to relics. Fragments of bone, cloth, or hair became substitutes. Others used charms with crosses or biblical verses. While still Christian, these substitutes lacked emotional richness and visual storytelling. Folk religion also adapted through oral performance. Villagers recited chants describing saints' faces, turning imagery into song. These chants preserved icon identity without physical presence. Rural priests encouraged songs when icons were banned, using memory as resistance. Another aspect of popular religion involved miracle expectation. Some icons were believed to bleed, cry, or release fragrant scent. These phenomena reinforced spiritual presence. Iconoclasm destroyed access to miracles, creating spiritual depression. Without icons, villagers doubted whether saints still intervened. Emotional confusion led some people to reinterpret dreams. They believed saints visited them through visions to replace lost images. Dream iconography became a new spiritual language. Popular religion also used icons to resolve disputes. Villagers swore oaths before icons to ensure honesty. Removing icons weakened oath culture. Without the visual presence of saints, legal trust eroded. People questioned fairness in trade, property rights, and neighborly agreements. Icon destruction also influenced magic practices. Some individuals turned to amulets, astrology, or pagan remnants. Authorities accused iconoclasm of unintentionally reviving superstition by eliminating orthodox imagery. This irony shows how suppressing icons did not purify religion, it destabilized it. Resistance occupied cultural imagination. Myths formed. Icons sinking into rivers to escape desecration. Icons traveling alone to foreign lands. Icons glowing in the dark. These legends reflected popular longing. When iconoclasm ended, the resurgence of icons sparked emotional relief. People cried upon seeing restored images in churches. Families embraced icons as lost relatives returned home. Villages held all-night vigils beside freshly painted icons. Pilgrimage returned with greater enthusiasm. Cherished icons became communal symbols. Towns adopted local, wonder-working images as their identity. Icons serve as civic guardians protecting against famine, plague, and war. Therefore, iconoclasm's influence on daily life reveals how deeply religious imagery shapes personal and communal existence. The movement disrupted emotional security, spiritual cohesion, legal trust, childbirth ritual, funeral tradition, and social unity. Popular religion emerged wounded but resilient, more emotionally aware and spiritually passionate. The end of iconoclasm in 843 did not simply restore the earlier theological world. It produced an entirely new intellectual and spiritual environment in Byzantium. Orthodox theology after iconoclasm became richer, sharper, and more self-aware because the controversy had forced theologians and clergy to articulate ideas that were once assumed rather than examined. As a result, the theological identity of Eastern Christianity evolved significantly, drawing lessons from the century-long struggle. Understanding how orthodoxy rebuilt itself after iconoclasm provides insight into the long-term significance of the crisis for global Christianity. After 843, Orthodox leaders immediately faced a major challenge: how to heal doctrinal wounds without reigniting conflict. The restoration of icons did not magically erase the century of bitterness between iconophiles and iconoclasts. Many clergy previously loyal to imperial icon bans feared punishment or humiliation. Others still rejected icon veneration privately. The church had to decide: punish the past, erase the past, or transform the past into teaching. The strategy chosen blended mercy with memory. Patriarch Methodios, the leading church figure during Restoration, understood that triumph required compassion. He avoided mass retribution. Instead of executing or permanently exiling iconoclast clergy, he offered paths to repentance. Many accepted reconciliation, acknowledging the legitimacy of icons. This forgiveness prevented the church from fragmenting into hostile factions. Yet Methodios also protected doctrinal boundaries by condemning iconoclasm theologically, ensuring it would not resurface. The church next emphasized doctrinal clarification. Although the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 had restored icon veneration, iconoclasm had questioned the philosophical basis of sacred images. Therefore, theologians began explaining icons in deeper, more systematic ways. They wrote homilies and treatises describing why icons did not violate the second commandment, why matter could express holiness, and why Christ's humanity required visible depiction. This period produced some of the most influential theological works in Orthodoxy. Writers argued that divine revelation occurs through history, not only through scripture, and iconography served as history painted. They taught that salvation involved union between God and matter through the incarnation. Icons became doctrinal proof, linking theology to artistic creation. Monastic theologians, such as the Studite school, continued refining the relationship between icons and liturgy. They explained why icons belonged not just in private devotion, but in worship itself. Icons surrounded the Eucharist, representing the presence of saints along with believers. This reinforced theological anthropology. Humans were not isolated individuals. They belonged to a cosmic community of living and departed believers. Icon theology also shaped Byzantine Christology. The debate forced theologians to clarify how Christ possessed both divine and human natures without confusion. Because icons represented Christ's human body, the church insisted his body was real, physical, and visible, not symbolic. This emphasis countered earlier heresies like Docetism, which claimed Christ only appeared human. With iconoclasm defeated, Orthodox theology embraced material sacramentality. Matter became the vehicle for divine grace, whether through icons, relics, water, oil, bread, or wine. This embodied theology distinguished orthodoxy from both Western scholastic rationalism and Eastern Islamic aniconism. Another post-iconoclast development was the stronger role of church councils. Iconoclasm revealed that imperial interference in doctrine was dangerous, so the church elevated conciliar tradition as the guardian of truth. The triumph of orthodoxy became a celebration not just of icons, but of the church's authority to define belief. Thus, the end of iconoclasm marked the beginning of mature Orthodox theology, firmly grounded in tradition, yet sharpened by crisis. Theological development after iconoclasm also reshaped the Orthodox understanding of revelation and knowledge. During the controversy, iconoclasts argued that truth must remain purely intellectual and invisible. Iconophiles countered that knowledge of God flows through all human faculties: mind, senses, imagination, and emotion. After Restoration, Orthodox teachers expanded this view, turning icon theology into a broader epistemological system, shaping worship, philosophy, and scriptural interpretation. Post-iconoclast writers taught that human beings learn truth visually and relationally. Icons, they argued, communicate theology through beauty, silence, and contemplation more effectively than written arguments alone. They reasoned that just as Christ used parables through imagery, icons continued that visual teaching tradition. As a result, Byzantine worship became increasingly aesthetic. Chant, incense, vestments, and architecture blended with icons to create multisensory theology. This development helped Byzantine mysticism flourish. Having survived iconoclast rationalism, Orthodox spirituality embraced apophatic theology, the belief that God transcends description. Icons served not only as teaching tools, but as mystical windows to divine mystery. The faithful prayed before icons not to analyze meaning, but to stand in presence of spiritual light. This approach shaped hesychasm, the major mystical movement of later centuries. Hesychasm emphasized inner silence, mental prayer, and spiritual vision. The movement drew strength from post-iconoclast theological ideas. If icons revealed inner divine reality, so could human hearts purified through prayer. Without iconoclasm, hesychasm may not have developed with such depth because the controversy strengthened belief that holiness dwelled within the material world. This era also redefined the theology of saints. Iconoclasm had denied saint imagery, questioning whether saints held intercessory power. After Restoration, theologians elaborated on communion with saints, teaching that icons demonstrated the interconnectedness of the Church across time. Saints were not distant memories. They were present companions. Iconography visualized the living community of faith. Mariology also flourished. Icons of the Virgin Mary grew central to devotion, not only as symbolic mother of Christ, but as the spiritual mother of humanity. The famous type Platitera, wider than the heavens, depicting Mary holding Christ in cosmic embrace, became widespread after 843. This shift shows how theology and art merged to express profound truths. Icon post-Restoration theology also shaped Orthodox anthropology. Because icons portrayed saints with transfigured features, believers learned that holiness did not erase individuality. Rather, it perfected humanity. The icon taught that salvation meant transformation into divine likeness, not escape from material existence. Finally, post-iconoclast theology reshaped understanding of sin and forgiveness. The Church's gentle treatment of former iconoclasts reflected a belief in spiritual healing. The Synodicon recited annually condemned doctrines, not people. This preserved unity while teaching that truth triumphs without requiring human destruction. Orthodoxy emerged from iconoclasm as a tradition deeply connected to visual theology, spiritual imagination, and sacramental worldview. The legacy of iconoclasm in Orthodox theological history continues into the modern era. Even today, Orthodox icons reflect lessons learned through the controversy: discipline, humility, symbolic precision, and doctrinal clarity. But more than that, the post-iconoclast Church reshaped theological methodology itself. First, it strengthened tradition as interpretive authority. Iconoclasm revealed the danger of doctrinal innovation imposed by rulers. Therefore, Orthodox theology after 843 increasingly emphasized continuity with the past. Church councils, patristic writings, liturgical practice, and iconographic canon became foundations for teaching. The concept of holy tradition solidified, not static repetition, but living memory guided by the Holy Spirit. Second, theology became more participatory. In the centuries following iconoclasm, liturgy incorporated public icon veneration. Processions, feast days, and blessing of homes affirmed shared identity. The faithful learned theology not only through books, but through ritual movement and communal imagery. Third, icon theology influenced Orthodox mission. Missionaries to Slavic lands taught Christianity visually through icons. Illiterate converts learned Bible history by seeing it, not reading it. This method explains why orthodoxy prevailed among Slavs even when Latin Christianity attempted competition. Fourth, theology after iconoclasm shaped Orthodox resistance to Western scholasticism. Latin theologians in the medieval period emphasized rational analysis and logical definition of doctrine. Orthodoxy, influenced by icon theology, emphasized mystery, contemplation, and symbol. These differences, rooted partly in iconoclasm, contributed to widening philosophical separation between Eastern and Western Christianity. The post-iconoclast centuries also saw icons expand into new theological roles. Icons became used in confession, spiritual direction, marriage preparation, healing rituals, and political ceremonies. They shaped civic identity in cities like Kiev, Novgorod, and Moscow. Russian icon schools emerged, blending Byzantine foundations with Slavic creativity. Rublov's Trinity icon, one of Christianity's greatest works, embodies theological ideas born in post-iconoclasm orthodoxy. Unity, peace, hospitality, and divine presence expressed through beauty. Moreover, the memory of iconoclasm protected the Church from future attempts to eliminate imagery. Even in Ottoman-ruled Greece, icons remained central symbols of cultural survival. In Soviet Russia, icons became emblems of resistance to atheism. The lessons of iconoclasm, faith cannot be erased by force, continued shaping identity. Second, theology became more participatory. In the centuries following iconoclasm, liturgy incorporated public icon veneration. Processions, feast days, and blessing of homes affirmed shared identity. The faithful learned theology not only through books, but through ritual movement and communal imagery. Third, icon theology influenced Orthodox mission. Missionaries to Slavic lands taught Christianity visually through icons. Illiterate converts learned Bible history by seeing it, not reading it. This method explains why orthodoxy prevailed among Slavs even when Latin Christianity attempted competition. Fourth, theology after iconoclasm shaped Orthodox resistance to Western scholasticism. Latin theologians in the medieval period emphasized rational analysis and logical definition of doctrine. Orthodoxy, influenced by icon theology, emphasized mystery, contemplation, and symbol. These differences, rooted partly in iconoclasm, contributed to widening philosophical separation between Eastern and Western Christianity. The post-iconoclast centuries also saw icons expand into new theological roles. Icons became used in confession, spiritual direction, marriage preparation, healing rituals, and political ceremonies. They shaped civic identity in cities like Kiev, Novgorod, and Moscow. Russian icon schools emerged, blending Byzantine foundations with Slavic creativity. Rublov's Trinity icon, one of Christianity's greatest works, embodies theological ideas born in post-iconoclasm orthodoxy. Unity, peace, hospitality, and divine presence expressed through beauty. Moreover, the memory of iconoclasm protected the Church from future attempts to eliminate imagery. Even in Ottoman-ruled Greece, icons remained central symbols of cultural survival. In Soviet Russia, icons became emblems of resistance to atheism. The lessons of iconoclasm, faith cannot be erased by force, continued shaping identity. Today, icon theology influences global Christian thought. Protestant scholars studying orthodoxy increasingly respect sacramental worldview. Catholic theologians draw on icon spirituality to renew understanding of saints. Orthodox icons appear in churches around the world, communicating theology visually across languages and cultures. Thus, the theological trajectory shaped by post-iconoclasm orthodoxy demonstrates that crises can produce growth. The destruction of icons sharpened understanding of incarnation, sacramentality, memory, anthropology, mysticism, and tradition. The restoration of icons sparked renaissance in theology, art, and spirituality. Iconoclasm, far from being a tragic interruption, became a catalyst that defined the soul of Eastern Christianity. When studying the Byzantine iconoclasm, most historians focus on theology or politics, but the movement also deeply reshaped the empire's economic structures and financial behavior. Economic history, trade networks, taxation, land distribution, craftsmanship, and resource management reveals how iconoclasm influenced economic decline, recovery, and even transformation across the empire. These economic shifts created ripple effects in agriculture, aristocratic wealth, urban industry, international commerce, and social class relationships. Understanding this dimension provides a holistic picture of how a religious controversy altered daily survival and imperial strategy. To begin, iconoclasm emerged during a period of economic strain. The early 8th century witnessed military losses, shrinking territory, and population decline due to plague and war. These pressures weakened imperial revenue streams. Emperor Leo III and Constantine V viewed iconoclasm not only as religious reform, but as economic restructuring. Their policies targeted monastic wealth, land ownership, and production control. Monasteries, though religious institutions, were major economic powers. They owned vineyards, mills, farms, fishing rights, and artisanal workshops producing textiles, manuscripts, and candles. Monastic estates often functioned as self-sufficient villages, employing peasants and craftsmen. When iconoclast emperors confiscated monastic land, their aim extended beyond theology. They intended to redirect economic resources toward military priorities. Constantine V redistributed monastic estates to soldiers of the Tagmata elite armies. These grants rewarded loyalty and encouraged new agricultural production. However, this redistribution produced unintended consequences. Monks who once managed estates responsibly and sustainably were replaced by soldiers lacking agricultural expertise. Poor resource management often followed, reducing productivity. In urban areas, iconoclasm affected artisanal industries. Icon painting workshops closed, affecting pigment merchants, stone masons, carpenters, and mosaic artisans. Whole networks collapsed. Quarry operations supplying marble for icon frames slowed. Metalworkers lost buyers for gold and silver in shrines. Traders who sold religious art to pilgrims suffered income loss. The economic decline in artisan communities led to unemployment and migration. Skilled artists fled to Italy, North Africa, or Slavic regions. Their relocation spread Byzantine artistic influence abroad, ironically strengthening foreign art while weakening domestic industry. Trade also shifted internationally. Byzantine merchants had long exported luxury items such as silk textiles and religious icons. Muslim and Western markets respected Byzantine craftsmanship. After icon bans, trade in religious images nearly ceased. Western demand for icons continued, but supply diminished. This economic gap allowed Italian merchants, especially Venetians, to import icons from other regions, then later dominate Mediterranean trade. Domestically, iconoclasm weakened pilgrimage tourism. Pilgrimage routes generated revenue through inns, ship fees, local markets, and souvenirs. When icons vanished, pilgrimage shrines lost significance, damaging regional economies. Some towns dependent on pilgrimage collapsed. However, iconoclasm also encouraged new industries. As imperial workshops replaced icon production with alternative crafts, cross engraving, liturgical textile design, pottery painting, economic diversification occurred. These industries could not fully compensate for lost icon revenue, but they prevented total collapse. Military spending increased dramatically. Constantine V's campaigns against the Bulgars required enormous resources. Iconoclastic confiscation funded weapon manufacturing, soldier salaries, horse breeding programs, and fortress construction. The imperial treasury moved wealth from monastic to militarized economy. But military economy had costs. Heavy taxation burdened peasants already struggling with war disruption. Some villages abandoned farmland to avoid taxes, decreasing grain output. Food scarcity increased prices and social unrest. In conclusion, iconoclasm altered Byzantine economics through confiscation, reallocation, industry disruption, labor mobility, and shifting trade networks. While some consequences strengthened military infrastructure, many damaged long-term economic stability. Another crucial economic dimension concerns the aristocracy and class distribution. Before iconoclasm, monasteries served as a balancing force against aristocratic power. Because monasteries owned land across regions, they limited dynastic families from monopolizing territory. When iconoclast emperors confiscated monastic estates, these lands sometimes passed to aristocrats rather than soldiers, either legally or through corruption. You have just completed one of the most challenging and most breathtaking historical journeys ever recorded. The story of Byzantine iconoclasm. Today you learned how an empire nearly destroyed itself over religion, how politics corrupted faith and faith resisted power, how ordinary villagers, mothers, monks, artists, and soldiers shaped world history, how icons became symbols of identity and hope, how this struggle changed art, economy, warfare, law, education, theology, and daily life, how the Orthodox world emerged stronger, wiser, and more united after the flames, and how the memory of iconoclasm still influences modern Christianity, Russia, Europe, Islam, and global art today. The moral of this history is simple yet powerful. Ideas matter. Faith matters. Images matter. Memory matters. When a state tried to control belief, people did not surrender. When images were banned, imagination did not die. When voices were silenced, truth survived through whisper and ink. Iconoclasm teaches us that no empire, no ruler, no law can erase identity from the human heart. If you enjoyed this journey, then remember, this is only the beginning. History is full of battles like this, between faith and power, between truth and fear, between people and empires. So make sure you stay connected with History Teller YT, because more powerful stories are on the way. Lost empires, forgotten wars, forbidden religions, dark ages, golden ages, revolutions, mysteries, leaders, and legends. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. And thank you for keeping history alive. This is History Teller YT, signing off for today. See you again in the next story. Until then, stay curious, stay passionate, and never stop exploring the past. This redistribution empowered provincial elites. Large-scale landlords gained control over villages, grain production, and tenant labor. Their wealth enabled them to influence imperial politics through bribery, marriage alliances, and military patronage. Thus, iconoclasm unintentionally strengthened aristocratic autonomy. After the controversy ended, aristocrats proved difficult to control, contributing to later conflicts in the 10th and 11th centuries when wealthy military families challenged imperial authority. Another factor concerns urban market structure. Iconoclasm altered consumer culture. Religious spending, candles, lamp oil, icon commissions, icon frames had once driven urban retail growth. Households bought oil for icon lamps weekly, providing stable income for merchants. Removing icons cut oil consumption drastically. Lamp makers suffered losses. Olive oil demand dropped. Trade networks between agricultural regions and cities weakened. Additionally, iconoclasm disrupted silver and gold demand. Icon frames required precious metals. When icons were banned, silversmiths pivoted to secular luxury goods, belts, jewelry, weapon hilts. Yet, this market was limited to elites. Economic inequality widened. Wealthy aristocrats collected gold artifacts, while common workers lost employment in icon-related industries. The fiscal reforms of Leo III also changed taxation patterns. His Ekliga, a legal reform document, included fiscal restructuring meant to adjust penalties and protect the vulnerable. While some laws softened punishments, tax burdens remained high. Iconoclastic policies did nothing to address systemic poverty. In rural settings, peasant life changed significantly. Monastic landlords typically offered stable rents and spiritual benefits. Peasants believed working on monastic land ensured divine blessing and protection. When estates transferred to soldiers or aristocrats, peasants lost spiritual connection to their labor. Many faced new exploitation, including increased rents, forced military service, or eviction. This destabilization led to migration. Peasants fled to frontier regions, increasing population in militarized zones. Agricultural production also shifted. Monasteries often specialized in vineyards and olive groves. Aristocrats preferred grain because grain fed armies. Result: cultural agriculture declined. Wine and oil exports stagnated, weakening Byzantine trade. Trade with the Islamic world expanded under iconoclasm. Muslim merchants valued Byzantine silk and glassware regardless of icon policy. In exchange, Byzantium imported spices, sugar, linen, and medicine. This trade sustained imperial income even as domestic industry struggled. Under the Second Iconoclast period, Emperor Theophilos invested in palace complexes and court luxury. Silk factories revived, using imperial funds rather than monastic patronage. Public works provided employment, but primarily in Constantinople. Rural poverty persisted. Iconoclasm also shaped foreign economic alliances. The papacy, angered by icon destruction, shifted political loyalty to the Franks. Charlemagne's empire challenged Byzantine trade privileges in the West. The Carolingians promoted trade routes, bypassing Byzantine markets, weakening Byzantine commercial dominance. Iconoclasm helped fracture Western economic integration. The long-term effect of aristocratic empowerment and rural impoverishment contributed to 11th century crises. Although iconoclasm itself ended in 843, the class-based wounds it caused influenced later centuries of rebellion, civil war, and economic imbalance. Thus, iconoclasm contributed to aristocratic ascendancy, peasant hardship, urban decline, and long-term structural instability. To understand the complete economic impact of iconoclasm, we must explore how religious art restoration shaped economic revival after 843. The end of iconoclasm created a sudden surge in demand for icon painters, sculptors, mosaicists, stonemasons, and manuscript illuminators. Slowly, as the empire recovered, an artistic golden age emerged, known as the Macedonian Renaissance. Artistic patronage flourished. Wealthy families funded icon restorations to proclaim loyalty to orthodoxy. Churches hired painters to decorate apses, domes, and naves. New icon screens required carpenters, engravers, and goldsmiths. This artistic boom also renewed pigment production. Quarries reopened to harvest ochre and red earth. Traders imported lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, malachite from Anatolia, and azurite from Cyprus. Workshops across cities and monasteries revived, especially in Constantinople, Mount Athos, Thessaloniki, and Cappadocia. Icon painting academies emerged, training generations of artists. This professionalization strengthened intellectual economy. Pilgrimage economies rebounded dramatically. Once icons were restored, shrines reopened. Pilgrims traveled across Byzantine lands, seeking miraculous images. Inns, taverns, and markets thrived. Pilgrimage routes stimulated road construction and maritime transport. Monasteries regained economic strength. Return land allowed them to rebuild vineyards, mills, and workshops. Their new wealth funded manuscript copying, education, and charity. Yet, monasteries remembered iconoclasm's trauma. They diversified income streams to prevent future vulnerability. Trade connections with the Latin West resumed, though distrust remained. Italian merchants purchased Byzantine icons and exported them westward. This trade enriched Mediterranean markets. Ironically, iconoclasm's defeat strengthened Byzantine cultural influence abroad. The Restoration also stimulated intellectual property economy. Scholars wrote theological treatises defending icons. Scribes copied manuscripts for sale. Churches bought liturgical books. Schools expanded their libraries. Knowledge itself became an economic asset. Agriculture recovered slowly because rural restructuring during iconoclasm left lasting scars. But over time, peasant families resettled monastic land and re-established communal farming networks. Grain production stabilized. Wine exports revived. Olive groves returned to profitable output. However, not all economic consequences were positive. Icon restoration required enormous material and labor investment. Churches spent huge sums replacing destroyed mosaics. State funds that could have supported military defense went to artistic revival. Some historians argue that post-iconoclast artistic spending contributed indirectly to later weaknesses in Byzantine defense budgets. Economically, one of the most profound consequences of iconoclasm was the reshaping of artisan identity. Before the controversy, artists were anonymous servants of religious vision. After, they became recognized experts with intellectual authority. Their work required theological training, making icon painting a scholarly craft rather than mere manual labor. This development elevated economic status of artisans. Additionally, iconoclasms and reintegrated Byzantine economy into Christian cultural networks. Trade with Italian city-states expanded. Slavic regions imported icons. Syriac Christians purchased Greek manuscripts. In summary, iconoclasm disrupted economic stability through confiscation and industry collapse, but indirectly stimulated economic rebirth through artistic renaissance, pilgrimage revival, and international trade renewal. The controversy demonstrated how intertwined religion and economics were in Byzantium. Scholars wrote theological treatises defending icons. Scribes copied manuscripts for sale. Churches bought liturgical books. Schools expanded their libraries. Knowledge itself became an economic asset. Agriculture recovered slowly because rural restructuring during iconoclasm left lasting scars. But over time, peasant families resettled monastic land and re-established communal farming networks. Grain production stabilized. Wine exports revived. Olive groves returned to profitable output. However, not all economic consequences were positive. Icon restoration required enormous material and labor investment. Churches spent huge sums replacing destroyed mosaics. State funds that could have supported military defense went to artistic revival. Some historians argue that post-iconoclast artistic spending contributed indirectly to later weaknesses in Byzantine defense budgets. Economically, one of the most profound consequences of iconoclasm was the reshaping of artisan identity. Before the controversy, artists were anonymous servants of religious vision. After, they became recognized experts with intellectual authority. Their work required theological training, making icon painting a scholarly craft rather than mere manual labor. This development elevated economic status of artisans. Additionally, iconoclasms and reintegrated Byzantine economy into Christian cultural networks. Trade with Italian city-states expanded. Slavic regions imported icons. Syriac Christians purchased Greek manuscripts. In summary, iconoclasm disrupted economic stability through confiscation and industry collapse, but indirectly stimulated economic rebirth through artistic renaissance, pilgrimage revival, and international trade renewal. The controversy demonstrated how intertwined religion and economics were in Byzantium. Icons were not simply images. They were engines of commerce, industry, employment, and social prosperity. To understand Byzantine iconoclasm fully, we must explore how it reshaped the empire's military structure, ideological identity among soldiers, and strategic decision-making on the battlefield. Military culture in Byzantium was deeply integrated into the political and theological world. Soldiers were not simply fighters. They were agents of imperial authority, defenders of orthodoxy, and representatives of Roman martial heritage stretching back to antiquity. Therefore, when icon veneration became a contested doctrine, the army as an institution was inevitably drawn into the struggle. Military involvement began with the reign of Emperor Leo III, himself a seasoned general. He rose to power after defending Constantinople against the Arab siege of 717 to 718, earning acclaim as a military savior. His legitimacy came not from aristocratic lineage, but from battlefield leadership. Because of this background, the army trusted him, and he trusted the army more deeply than civilian elites or ecclesiastical councils. When he embraced iconoclasm, his soldiers followed, at least initially, not because they fully grasped theological argument, but because they believed that the emperor who saved them militarily also possessed divine guidance. The iconoclast narrative appealed to military psychology. The empire had endured catastrophic defeats. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Armenia fell to Muslim armies. These losses shook military morale. Soldiers asked why God allowed defeat. Iconoclast emperors answered, because God punished idolatry. This explanation, though simplistic, restored hope. If icons caused defeat, banning them promised victory. The promise of divine military success became a motivational tool. Constantine V exploited this dynamic brilliantly. He portrayed himself as God's chosen warrior, purifying Christianity to win wars. His campaigns against the Bulgars achieved real success, reinforcing belief that iconoclasm worked. His propaganda spread through military camps. Soldiers marched under banners featuring the cross alone, without saints' images. They believed they fought in a purified army. Military hymns praised Constantine's piety and military genius. He held military parades emphasizing icon destruction as proof of faith. Archaeological evidence supports this transformation. Military shields began showing simple cross motifs rather than saint portraits. Helmets and banners shifted from images of Archangel Michael to abstract Christian symbols. The army visually embodied theology. The military also enforced icon policy. Soldiers destroyed icons in churches, arrested monks, guarded exiled bishops, and escorted imperial officials to enforce decrees. This dual role, warrior and religious police, blurred boundaries between spiritual and military duty. Soldiers viewed themselves as crusaders long before the Western Crusades existed. Yet, iconoclasm generated tension within the military. Many soldiers came from rural Anatolia, where icon devotion remained strong. When asked to destroy images, some refused. Others obeyed outwardly, but continued venerating icons secretly at home. This tension created psychological strain. Military families felt conflict deeply. Wives and mothers who kept icons in private spaces sometimes clashed with husbands enforcing imperial law. Children experienced contradictory beliefs: loyalty to the emperor versus loyalty to saints. The army became a microcosm of national identity conflict. Iconoclasm also altered military recruitment. Emperors rewarded supporters by granting land confiscated from monasteries to soldiers. These soldiers became bound to the emperor economically. Military aristocracy emerged through these land grants, reshaping regional power networks. However, the belief that iconoclasm guaranteed military success collapsed after Constantine V. Later emperors suffered defeats despite icon bans. Arab raids intensified, Bulgarian armies triumphed, and frontier regions shrank. Soldiers began doubting theology linked to warfare. This doubt weakened loyalty to iconoclast rulers and encouraged rebellion. The army played a key role in ending iconoclasm. Irene used elite palace troops, loyal to both her regency and icon veneration, to overthrow Constantine VI's iconoclast regents. Later, in the Second Iconoclast period, military failures under Theophilos, especially against the Abbasids, undermined iconoclast prestige. Soldiers began believing that banning icons brought not victory, but divine punishment. Thus, the army was both defender and destroyer of iconoclasm, proving that theology woven into warfare carries unpredictable consequences. Another dimension of iconoclasm involves how warfare influenced the spread and enforcement of doctrine. Military culture shaped theological identity, and theological positions shaped tactics, alliances, and morale. Understanding this interplay helps us see iconoclasm not as an isolated intellectual movement, but as a military ideology forged within battlefield crisis. The Byzantine army spent much of the 7th and 8th centuries fighting Islamic forces across Anatolia and the Mediterranean. Soldiers encountered Islamic icon rejection firsthand. They saw mosques decorated with calligraphy rather than imagery. Some interpreted Muslim success as evidence that aniconism pleased God. Returning soldiers carried these impressions back into Byzantine life. Propaganda emphasized this comparison. Icon supporters allegedly caused divine anger, while Islamic success proved icon rejection. Constantine V capitalized on this belief, describing icons as weapons of the devil weakening Christian armies. He argued that Christ never instructed believers to paint his image. His treatises linked military defeat to heresy, embedding iconoclasm within national survival ideology. Iconoclasm also shaped military diplomacy. Treaties with Muslim rulers sometimes required the removal of border icons to avoid provoking Islamic sensibilities. In other cases, the empire used icon rejection as a bargaining chip, presenting itself as doctrinally closer to Islam than the Latin West. This diplomatic maneuvering was controversial and later weaponized by iconophile historians, who accused iconoclast rulers of betraying Christianity to impress Muslim enemies. Meanwhile, iconoclasm reshaped military ritual. Before the controversy, troops kissed icons before marching to war. Commanders carried icons into battle for blessing and morale. During iconoclasm, these rituals vanished. Soldiers relied on prayers, relics, or verbal blessings instead. Emotional connection to saints diminished, reducing psychological comfort in warfare. Military oaths changed too. Soldiers once swore loyalty before icons of Christ or Mary. Iconoclasm replaced these with cross-symbol oaths. Oath-taking became abstract, less personal. This shift altered the emotional texture of loyalty. An icon represented a face. A cross represented a concept. Another consequence involved military resistance. Some army factions loyal to images rebelled against iconoclast emperors. The most notable was Artabasdos' revolt against Constantine V. Artabasdos used icon veneration to rally troops across Anatolia, claiming divine support. His brief reign demonstrated that icon devotion could mobilize armies as effectively as imperial force. Though his rebellion failed, it showed that the army was ideologically divided. This division reappeared during the Second Iconoclast period, when military units questioned Leo V's icon policy. Some commanders mistrusted the emperor's theological leadership, contributing to instability. The aftermath of iconoclasm also reshaped military identity. After 843, icons regained central role in military symbolism. Soldiers carried images of Christ and Mary in battle. The Virgin Mary became Theotokos Strategos, commander mother, believed to lead armies invisibly. Military banners displayed saints again. Soldiers prayed before icons before combat. This restored imagery, reinforced unity. Military hierarchy used icons to cultivate morale and loyalty to empire. Sacred images decorated barracks, gates, ships, and fortresses. Emperors paraded icons publicly before campaigns. Icon theology helped maintain discipline too. Soldiers feared divine punishment if they desecrated icons, encouraging moral conduct. Icons became spiritual oversight, visible reminders that God observed behavior. Thus, iconoclasm changed military culture. It removed saints from warfare psychology. It altered rituals and oath practices. It redefined loyalty. It shaped diplomacy. It produced rebellion. It transformed morale. The army emerged from iconoclasm changed, spiritually wounded, yet spiritually renewed. The military consequences of iconoclasm were not limited to ideological shifts. They directly influenced military strategy, infrastructure development, and empire survival. Understanding these structural changes reveals how theological movements shape practical power dynamics. Constantine V, despite later being vilified by icon-loving chroniclers, transformed the Byzantine army into one of the strongest forces of the early medieval world. His reforms included reorganizing supply lines, improving cavalry training, expanding fortress networks, and rebuilding the navy. These improvements laid the foundation for future victories. Yet, because he was an iconoclast, these reforms were remembered negatively in theological memory. The Bulgarian frontier warfare demonstrated how theology influenced military planning. Constantine V launched 9 campaigns against Bulgaria, many successful. His victories convinced soldiers that iconoclasm attracted divine favor. Yet after his death, military losses reversed belief. Later defeats transformed earlier victories into forgotten history. This selective memory reveals how military success was interpreted through theological convenience. Strategic geography also interacted with iconoclasm. Frontier regions with strong icon devotion resisted imperial icon policy more intensely than urban Constantinople. Frontier soldiers depended heavily on saint icons for psychological protection. Because these troops faced daily danger, they trusted icons deeply. Their resistance weakened imperial cohesion. In naval culture, icons once decorated ship prows. Removing them changed maritime psychology. Sailors believed saints calmed storms. Their removal increased fear, even though the Navy continued functioning. Maritime superstition clashed with doctrine. Another strategic consequence was manpower distribution. Soldiers receiving confiscated monastic land were expected to farm and fight. But dual responsibility weakened troop discipline. Many became farmers first. This reduced military readiness. Monastic estates previously managed for long-term stability became short-term exploitation zones. After iconoclasm ended, emperors faced military restructuring challenges. Iconoclast rulers had relied too heavily on elite troops in Constantinople. Post-843 emperors reinvested in provincial armies and thematic troops to prevent court militarization. Importantly, iconoclasm damaged the empire's propaganda advantage. Before the controversy, Byzantium claimed to be the only true Christian empire.